My name's Brandon and this is Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on a certain franchise of video games and retrospectively review them. This week we're going hands-on with the first of the two Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends games that were released. This game, simply titled Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, was released for the Game Boy Advance, despite the previous Cartoon Network game being on the Nintendo DS. It always feels weird when something like this happens, even though there are legitimate reasons to keep releasing on old consoles when newer iterations have been released. The game was released on October 17, 2006 and was published by Crave Entertainment. Crave Entertainment actually had an extensive history of publishing Cartoon Network and cartoon-based games in general before their closure in 2012. They published Camp Lazlo Leaky Lake games and both versions of Cartoon Network Punch Time Explosion, as well as two games based on the Men in Black animated series and Beyblade Let It Rip. The developer, Collision Studios, were also responsible for Camp Lazlo Leaky Lake games. There are only 2 available reviews for this game, and honestly, they're not the worst. It received a 70 from GameZone and a 55 from IGN. I'm honestly not too sure what to expect from a Foster's Home game, but hopefully I'm walking into something enjoyable. Each of the levels in Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends takes its inspiration directly from episodes of the show. This is a neat idea, and so far in my experience with Cartoon Network games, they haven't really done this. There are so many unique episodes of Foster's Home that the developers had an almost limitless amount of inspiration for fun gameplay and locations. Unfortunately, the game doesn't do any of this justice. The game is technically a platformer, I guess, but the platforming is actually very minimal and you're not going to find yourself falling into pits or anything like that. Instead, a better description of this game is to call it one very long fetch quest. You see, no matter what episode they base a level on, the objective is literally always for you to collect X number of objects. In the first level, you need to collect the items Duchess is requesting. In later levels based on the episodes featuring the Scribbles, the gang finding a box of puppies, and the one where they break Madame Foster's bust, they all just result in fetch quests to find items. This gameplay becomes old very quick, particularly because the amount of locations used here are tiny. The game is entirely set in the house, which fans of the show will know is huge. Here the house feels tiny though, an issue which is compounded by you repeatedly going to the same locations in every level. Off the top of my head I can think of roughly 10 different locations present in this game, which is not nearly good enough for the amount of backtracking here. There's one time they try to change up the gameplay in Dinner is Swerved, but it's a complete disaster and made me pretty mad seeing as it's one of my all-time favourite episodes. They try to go the stealth route here, but it's so poorly executed. The crux of this gameplay is pressing down on the D-pad when you come to an object, which makes you hide behind it. Enemies will just sprint back and forth, and it's up to you to time your run correctly to get to the next object you can hide behind. Only problem with this is that about 75% of the time they'll stop running while off screen, and if you don't move your character, they literally won't run into you ever again. As soon as you move your character again, they'll come sprinting back into frame, catch you out, and cause you to fail. This is either an annoying way to try and make this section a lot tougher, or was just very poorly programmed. In this episode, Mac and Blue are trying to find their way back from the roof, and at one point they somehow manage to end up back on the roof, despite going through a bunch of doors and they really shouldn't be back at the roof. This is a really funny moment in the show because you're not really expecting it, but what about making somebody play this? If you answered that it would be tedious as hell, you'd be correct. After going through a meaty stealth section, the last thing I wanted to do was go through the exact same meaty stealth section again immediately. It baffles me that they didn't include more actual platforming because the game control's surprisingly tight. If they'd simply made this a platformer, I actually think I would have been a big fan if they had just even half decent level design. Instead, what we have here is just a tedious and poorly designed game. So many nonsensical decisions are made here. At 2 points you need to make it down these broken staircases in a race against a time limit, but for some reason the game forces you to start over if you'd actually touch the stairs. Instead of walking down these staircases normally, you're forced to slide along the banisters. It's so easy to land on the stairs accidentally because of the way this mechanic is, so you end up screwing up what should be a straightforward section. The only other variation to the gameplay is the occasional boss battle with Terrence, Mac's older brother, but even these are repetitive. These battles are all practically identical, with you needing to lure Terrence into a trap, then pelt him with a paper ball. Doing this exact same battle multiple times is just yet another tedious aspect of this game, and to top it off, the boss battles aren't any good even when you look at them in isolation. Almost everything about this game is just frustrating and annoying. Just look at the soundtrack, which consists of one track for each level. These tracks are literally 10 seconds long and just loop repeatedly. You can see how this would be a problem when levels can be like 15 minutes long at times. I don't think I have to go into too much detail to explain why that is a freaking terrible idea. The same thing goes with the way they present the stories of each level to you. You're met with ridiculously long text boxes of exposition which are tedious to sit through. It ends up just being a poor man's version of putting across the story from the show. And it's not like anyone needed an in-depth story here, considering they just ripped everything straight from the show. Maybe if the story had been original, these long text sessions would have been more engaging, but because I knew literally every plot point here, it was just a slog. To give the game the slightest hint of replayability, there are red game tickets scattered throughout the house. Nabbing these progressively unlock minigames. As far as I could tell, there are only 3 minigames to unlock, and none of these are likely to keep anyone interested for long. They're literally the most bare-bones skee-ball, whack-a-mole, and paddleball games. Even the most enthusiastic kid would get tired of these additions after 5 minutes.
Will, I think it's great that you want to play in the NBA. But first, I want to give you a little bit of advice.
I've been practicing my game face, Steve. Check it out.
Nice. But I think there's a more important thing to start with, like nutrition. You see, food is like fuel. Whatever you put in your engine, the better your engine will run.
What about snacks?
Snacks are okay if you're making smart choices, like reaching for a piece of fruit when you get hungry.
So if I eat better food, my body's gonna work better and last longer.
You got it.
Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends is a dull game. The developers basically made a 2-hour-long fetch quest with a minuscule amount of locations that you're forced to tediously slog through over and over again. I have no idea why they didn't just make a platformer. They still could have used the framing of each level as an episode, and I'm sure this game would have ended up a million times better. Rather than that, we end up with an extremely boring game that has close to no redeeming qualities. Hopefully the DS entry is a lot better, but considering the people behind that also developed Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi the Genie and the Amp, I'm expecting the worst.